Most people pay attention to isolated moments, but behaviour becomes meaningful through repetition. Anybody can have one good day, one bad reaction, one emotional moment, one confident performance, one impressive conversation. That's not pattern recognition, that's snapshot thinking. Real observation happens across time because repeated behaviour tells the truth eventually. Well, always, actually. Human beings are incredibly patterned creatures, far more than we like to believe. Most people think they're making entirely conscious decisions all day long, but psychology shows much of human behaviour is actually conditioned, rehearsed, emotionally automated, environmentally reinforced, which means people often repeat emotional strategies long before they consciously understand them. And once you start noticing repetition, people become much easier to understand. This applies everywhere. Markets, relationships, leadership, business, friendships, identity. Even self-sabotage follows patterns. There's a reason experienced operators don't overreact to single events, because isolated events can mislead. Patterns rarely do. One emotional outburst means very little. Repeated inability to regulate emotion under pressure, that tells you something. You know, one broken promise might be circumstantial. Repeated inconsistency, well, that's structure. One impulsive decision, well, it's human nature. A life built on impulsive cycles, that's conditioning. And this is where observation becomes powerful, because repetition moves performance eventually. Anybody can temporarily present an image, but sustained behaviour exposes operating systems. Psychology sometimes refers to this through reinforcement loops. Behaviours that achieve emotional outcomes tend to repeat. If avoidance reduces discomfort, avoidance becomes reinforced. If aggression creates control, aggression becomes reinforced. If attention rewards chaos, chaos becomes reinforced. The nervous system learns this works, and even if it's destructive long term, it still does it. That's why repeated patterns matter more than intentions. Intentions describe who people hope to be. Patterns reveal who they currently are, and those are not always the same thing. Most people don't realise how predictable emotional behaviour becomes over time, not because humans are simple, because unexamined patterns repeat remarkably consistently. The same emotional triggers, the same defensive reactions, the same relationship dynamics, the same avoidance cycles, the same collapse points, different faces, different environments, different years, same behavioural architecture underneath. And once you notice this, you stop becoming surprised by outcomes, because outcomes are usually preceded by repeated behavioural clues, quietly, over months, over years, hidden in plain sight. Markets, they operate similarly. People think price moves randomly, emotionally, but crowd behaviour repeats consistently. Euphoria repeats, fear, repeats. Greed repeats. Capitulation repeats. Narrative cycles repeat. The emotional costume changes. Human behaviour underneath rarely does. That's why experienced participants focus so heavily on behavioural rhythm, because repetition creates probability. This matters personally too, because eventually you have to observe your own repetitions honestly. And that's uncomfortable. But it's necessary. Many people think they're trapped by circumstance when they're actually trapped by unconscious behavioural loops, repeating. The same emotional reactions, the same relationship patterns, the same procrastination cycles, the same financial behaviour, the same nervous system states, the same avoidance mechanisms again and again and again. But because each moment feels emotionally unique, they fail to recognise the underlying repetition. Awareness changes that. The moment you see the pattern clearly, something shifts, because unconscious loops rely on invisibility. Observation interrupts automation. There's an interesting psychological phenomenon here too. The brain prefers familiarity over optimization. Even painful familiarity can feel safer than unfamiliar growth. That's why people repeat damaging environments, damaging relationships, damaging habits. The nervous system prioritizes predictability surprisingly often, especially under stress. Which means repetition is not always evidence of desire. Sometimes it's evidence of conditioning. That distinction matters enormously, because people judge themselves morally for patterns that are often neurologically enforced, reinforced. And until the reinforcement changes, the loop usually continues. But this is also why repetition can become incredibly powerful positively, because identity itself is largely repetition. Confidence repeated becomes self-trust. Discipline repeated becomes stability. Calmness repeated becomes regulation. Observation repeated becomes perception. The nervous system adapts through consistency, quietly. Most transformation looks boring while it's happening. That's because repetition rarely feels dramatic day to day, yet repeated behaviour builds entire lives. And honestly, the older you get, the more obvious this becomes. You realise people rarely become completely different overnight. They become more exaggerated versions of repeated tendencies. The disciplined become more disciplined. The reactive become more reactive. The avoidant become more avoidant. The perceptive become more perceptive. Direction, that compounds. Which is why patterns matter so much. Not to be cynical, not to judge harshly, but to observe reality clearly. Because once you begin watching repetition instead of isolated moments, human behaviour becomes far less confusing. You stop listening only to your promises. You start observing consistency, emotional rhythm, pressure behaviour, accountability, attention allocation, repeated choices. And repeated choices eventually reveal priorities with incredible accuracy. The truth is, most people tell you who they are repeatedly. The problem is, people often listen emotionally instead of observing structurally. What repeats is rarely accidental. It's usually architecture. Anchoring light, awakening strength, the equilibrium path unfolds.